Hello and welcome to the Political Dispatch, the podcast that explores big issues and ideas in a conversational way.
My name is Lily Mott.
I'm Sid Kurabadi.
And I'm Tom Spare.
In today's episode, we focus on a recent report released by Channel 4 called Gen Z Trends, Truth, and Trust. The report explores the experiences and attitudes of young people in the UK.
The report summarizes a comprehensive study of 3,000 participants and found macro themes shaping Gen Z's world. And it includes declining happiness, gender divergence, trust issues within a fragmented information landscape. The research highlights 6 distinct Gen Z worldviews reflecting their diverse responses to societal challenges.
The study and report received a lot of buzz in the UK media. The launch of the report was streamed online, featuring the CEO of Channel 4 and a guest panel. CEO Alex Mohorn threw down the gauntlet to public service broadcasters like Channel 4 and the BBC to meet Generation Z where they are, not expect Generation Z to come to them. In the report, she writes, Gen Z's voices will shape the future. We have a responsibility as public service media to lead and to act, to restore bonds between young people and reliable sources of information. If not now, then when? And if not us, then who?
And despite the many findings that came from that report, the UK media focused on one line in particular, referencing Gen Z's preference for strong leaders. The report found that 52% of 13 to 27-year-olds would welcome a strong leader unbound by elections or parliament. Channel 4 later removed the quote from its promotion and admitted that they could not find the source for that stat.
And here's the problem. Often, when young people are talked about in the media frequently jump on the negative, which reinforces the views of legacy media, such as the newspapers, the BBC, and others. There's little room for positivity or nuance. That's one of the reasons why we started this podcast and joined Lily's network, Be the Change Media Network.
And just a bit of a reminder, the network is the only podcast network in the world dedicated to amplifying the voices of young people. We and the other hosts of the shows on this network are committed to sharing stories, creating meaningful conversations, and making change through multimedia content.
And as many of our co-hosts on the network and many of the members of the network are Gen Z, we thought that this would be the perfect time to reflect not only the survey results and the report findings, but we also wanted to counter some of the media attention garnered by the report and think about the wider implications that Gen Z's views could have on our society, our economy, and democracy itself, because I think there's so much beyond just this report and just the stats. There are so many stories behind this that we definitely need to explore a little bit more.
So, Tom, before you give us an overview of the report, could you clarify a few things? Who are Gen Z? That's one of my favorite questions, by the way. And could you tell us why Channel 4 are interested in finding out who they are and what their views are?
Cool, yeah, thanks, Sid. Well, according to the Pew Research Centre, Generation Z, anyone born between 1997 and 2012, this means we're talking about 13 to 27-year-olds. And my MA dissertation looked at the perceptions of Generation Z and their predecessor generation, millennials, in the Welsh press. And I found that Generation Z are, in a UK context, they are people brought up by a combination of Generation X, so people born between 1965 and 1980, and millennials, 1981 to 1996. They became socially aware after the 2007-8 financial crash. They're the children of austerity, a shrinking state, and worse public services. They know only of the digital world, so it could be defined as digital natives, having been born since the advent of Google, social media, and the mass use of artificial intelligence such as ChatGPT and other AI is available. They use edgy humor via social media to affirm their communities of belonging. They're invested in their community of identity. They do not believe in rigid hierarchy. They're self-reliant, but care about others and their impact on the world. Their teenage and early working lives have been hugely disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in their education, in making friends and building relationships. They had to pay substantially more in tuition fees than their older millennial counterparts, and older as well. Some older generations didn't even have to pay to go to university. Those were the days. They are less likely than millennials to be able to afford buying a property. Although if you're buying a property at 13, I'd be really impressed by that, I have to admit. They will earn less over their lifetime compared to previous generations and are less likely to inherit large sums of money from their Generation X and millennial parents. They're disillusioned by the past and possess a no-nonsense attitude about the present. Socially, politically, and economically, there's a growing divide within this generation, which we're going to talk about a bit later on.
Okay, so I think I resonated with a lot of the bullet points that you just listed out, Tom. I think that a lot of those apply to me. I'm Generation Z, but Tom and Sid, you guys,
We are millennials.
Millennials.
ooh, almost at the same
Millennials
time.
represent.
I'm not even going to start to try and use any Gen Z terminology because I've seen
Chicka
some
chicka
really
what?
fantastic. Yeah. What was that, Sid? You sounded like a chicken then. What did you say?
Yeah. It was some Gen Z reference to a chicken, I guess.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So, why are Channel 4 so interested specifically in Gen Z, Tom? Why was this study conducted?
Well, in short, Generation Z is not consuming much of Channel 4's content, as much as generations that have come before. So Channel 4 is a British free-to-air public service television broadcaster that began operations on the 2nd of November 1982. Unlike the BBC, Channel 4 is publicly owned but does not receive public funding. Instead, it's solely reliant on commercial activities, including advertising, and its advertising is sort of threatened by lots of different changing factors. So perhaps more than the BBC, they're reliant on eyeballs on their content because ultimately they need advertising to keep its service running.
And I know that we mentioned it at the very beginning, but remind me how many people took part in this survey that was conducted?
So 3,000 people split into two cohorts. There were 2,000 participants aged between 13 and 27, and 1,000 participants aged between 28 and 65. And I believe there was also like a cohort of about 30 that were interviewed as well between 13 and 65.
And what were the findings that they came to?
So there's sort of the key things are sort of summarized. There's a fragmented truth. So Gen Z construct their understanding of the world from a multitude of sources, often encountering conflicting information. So, if we were to compare Generation Z to perhaps their grandparents, who are probably more likely to receive their news from print media, Gen Z will go to a lot of different places and are reliant a lot of the time on their friends to get information and share information amongst themselves. And there's noticeably an erosion of trust. So there's a decline towards established institutions. They tend to place similar levels of trust across various sources, and they have sort of leading to sort of a flatter hierarchy of trust. So they sort of separate what they hear from traditional news sources, and they are a bit skeptical towards that. Also, it's shifting milestones. So economic pressures and the postponement of traditional adulthood markers are redefining life milestones. So a precarious job market, unaffordable housing. And so it's prompting young people to prioritize personal control and self-focus. There's also declining happiness. So, despite many of Gen Z as individuals reporting general happiness, there's a growing prevalence of mental health struggles, feelings of loneliness, and economic stresses. These challenges contribute to an overall decline in well-being, highlighting the need for targeted support and resources. There's also, as previously mentioned, a gender divergence. So, gender has become a significant dividing line in the political ideologies of young people. Studies have, like this one, are revealing that perspectives and priorities between genders within Generation Z are influencing political engagement and social attitudes. So, young Gen Z women are becoming more progressive, and then Generation Z men are becoming more conservative, which is an interesting sort of occurrence, really, because the assumption is as you go through the generations, they become more progressive as society and our understanding of the world changes. But now we seem to be at a confluence where in the UK and in other places around the world, there's more conservative men and more progressive women. Also, there's an idea of political reframing. So Gen Z is more politically aware than previous generations at the same age, but they exhibit lower levels of political engagement. This paradox suggests a reframing of political involvement, possibly due to disillusionment with traditional political structures. And that's consistent with this lack of trust of media institutions as well. So it goes any institutions really. In the report, it suggests they're a confused generation, which I think is a little bit unfair. There's a convergence of identity politics, misinformation, media fragmentation, and civil unrest, which intensifies the inherent confusion of coming of age for Gen Z. So navigating these complexities requires resilience and adaptability. There's a lot of zero-sum thinking. So many young people perceive life as a zero-sum game where the success of one group equates to the loss of another. This perspective can influence social interactions and policy preferences, underscoring the importance of fostering collaborative mindsets. And there's the triumph of the self. So, in response to external uncertainties, Gen Z prioritize an individualistic worldview, focusing on personal control and self and improvement. This emphasis on the self-reliance as a desire to navigate and mitigate the unpredictabilities of the broader world. And that also chimes with other studies which have suggested that Gen Z are drinking less and using drugs less and less risky behavior as well. So it's interesting that traditionally it used to be as the older you get, the more risk averse you are and the less risks you take. But it seems Gen Z are actually quite risk averse. So understanding these facets of Generation Z is crucial for developing supportive policies, creating resilient media content, and fostering intergenerational dialogue. As this generation continues to shape the future, acknowledging their unique experiences and perspectives becomes increasingly important.
And from the report, Tom, what were the most troubling findings that you came across when you went through it? I mean, some of the things that you mentioned already are raising alarm bells for sure, but what stood out for you the most?
The main thing is the divergence between the views of young men and young women. So, for example, in political ideology, gender is emerging as a sharp dividing line in young people's political ideology. Young women are becoming more significantly progressive, particularly on issues like immigration, racial justice, and you've also got to put in there the right to choose, women's health, and health generally, and the role that genders play in society. Whereas young men are becoming more conservative for the most part. Although they're still generally a liberal generation, young men are becoming more conservative. There's also like some really concerning views on the role of feminism and equality. So a minority of young men, 20 to 30%, feel threatened by female equality. Nearly half of men, 45%, believe that efforts to promote women's equality have gone so far that men are now discriminated against. In contrast, the girl power worldview, representing about 21% of Gen Z, consists almost exclusively of young women who are empowered and self-reliant. This group believes men and women can succeed together, especially regarding gender relations. And also, there's a couple more things. 47% of Gen Z men agree that masculinity is under attack. As gender roles shift, young men seek motivational figures to navigate modern masculinity, indicating a need for relatable and constructive role models. This is also reflected in the boys can't be boys worldview, where young men feel trapped by shifting societal expectations around masculinity and are uncertain about what it means to be a man today. And the big thing as well is academic and economic success. So by age 19, 54% of women are in higher education versus 40% of men. Young women aged 20 to 24 have higher employment rates and out earn young men on average. So that's a lot of information there, but they're my main concerns at the moment.
That's definitely quite a lot to go through and to process. I definitely went through the report myself, and one of the first things which I've always tried to read about when we try and read any reports which try and map social sort of trends and whatnot is the questionnaire. and try and see if I can access the questionnaire. I don't think I was able to do that because one of the things which you'd remember this, Tom, and when we learned it in class during our MA was how are the questions being framed. Iñaki was like very specific about the emphasis on that. The fact that a report or a survey would actually go ahead and give an option asking Gen Z, we don't know what the context exactly is, what the previous question was, what was the next question, how is the survey being designed in a way that's actually going to go ahead and make the participant think very independently and to ask an option like, would you welcome a strong leader unbound by elections or parliament? It's giving an option there, which, according to me, it lacks context at this point in time. So it's pretty hard to comment if they actually meant that that's the option that they really want to go for, or is it more of a sign of protest with the current political class, which is disillusionment and ignorance that is being shown by them towards this generation? I think that's the main takeaway that I had of from this report, that there is a lot of dissatisfaction. There is a lot of disapproval of the current political structure, which they feel is outdated. I think in general, Generation Z I think it's a generation that looks for positive results in a very quick time frame. And I say this with all due respect, Lily. So I'm not trying to diss anybody here, but which is actually pretty good. But politics, which talk of progress, which is ideally supposed to be steady progress rather than extremely rapid progress, is better for a democratic society compared to something which rapidly develops and then suddenly it just comes crashing down. That's what history really tells us. And I was quite fascinated by the whole idea that you have a younger generation that is becoming more conservative. Certain genders of the younger generation is becoming more conservative. And I wonder what's the influence of it all. What is actually causing that sort of influence? And I definitely see similar patterns in India as well. There is a certain sense of conservatism which has creeped in the younger society. A lot of it is to do with the presence of a continuous government since 2014. So they do dominate the news hour, they do dominate prime time advertisements, almost every section of the media. So it does play on your mind quite a bit. So I think that's one of the reasons, probably in the case of India. But the idea that a generation associates itself with something which is radical, something which shakes up the status quo, which they associate with the idea that they are change makers and there is a certain belief in chaos theory. I think that generates perspective that would actually go ahead and enable a certain generation to lean more towards conservatism or something which is not traditionally more bound by checks and balances because you want to get things done more quickly. That's my take on it. Having read that, I would say it's just one report. And from my research, apparently Channel 4 reports are quite accurate and they're pretty good. But still, it's one report. It has to be a sustained pattern that you have to see to actually draw conclusions. So I won't raise any alarm bells right now, but I would definitely keep my spider sense active and be on the lookout.
I think there's a lot I agree with a lot of that said. I think ever since looking at this report, of course, Trump being elected led me to think about this as well, but that idea of the political difference between young men and women, and I think that idea of maybe a push towards more conservatism, especially among young men. I think a big thing that I've thought a lot about is the perception that when some groups who have been historically marginalized receive more opportunities and they receive more freedom and they receive more support to be successful, often that can lead to some understanding that maybe your rights are being infringed upon or you're having less support. And so I think it's that idea of maybe young men might feel threatened by some of this. And that's kind of my perspective on that. I think that it might not be for everyone. That's not a blanket statement, but I think that it might be a level of subconsciousness, just thinking like, oh, women are now going to college at higher rates and they're earning more on average. And that might be threatening to some people. And that might lead to this shift towards conservatism, going back to how it used to be, make America great again. And of course, this is a poll from the UK, but I think the sentiment might still be the same. As you see other groups doing better, you might feel threatened because you're not. Obviously, that's not for everyone, but I think that might be something that could be at play here. But I think also with the world moving so quickly as well. I think that's another thing with technology, and this has always happened. This isn't new, but the changes in technology between generations. I think, of course, millennials have been on the internet, internet was part of millennials growing up. But I think it's just this change where now Gen Z is living online. Our social lives are online, our news is online, our school was online during the COVID pandemic. Every way that we had to relate to other people was online. And I think that that's really contributing to this generational divide that maybe other generations aren't understanding as much. It's kind of interesting when I talk to my parents. My parents are both teachers. I've talked about it a lot. I know it's kind of a broken record, but they work with young people all the time. So I think that they would probably be the most willing people to understand this world that we're living in. And they are around kids all the time and they raise three kids. But still, I think it's very hard to understand just how much of our lives are online. And it's this idea that there are new careers and there's new, ways of doing things just on social media. We communicate all through social media. We post and we take photos and we're doing all these things that are just very foreign. And I think that's a big thing as well with political engagement, because people might not feel as inspired to go to the polls now because they might not see the results that they want to see. They might not see that change. Like Sid, you were saying, they might not see these things playing out. So instead, people are turning to social media and they're using the tools that they know might work, and they're trying to get their voice out there in another way. Gen Z has just very much turned our lives online rather than maybe doing things in person, which I think there's a lot of things to be nervous about that, but I think there's also a lot of positives to that. We're seeing, the creator economy booming, and we're seeing all of these new careers coming out of this. And I think it's just a new world to explore. And I think that it might be hard for other generations, not necessarily millennials, not talking to you guys, but I think even older generations, and especially with a lot of our world leaders being much older, it's very hard to understand some of that. So like when TikTok was threatened, there was billions of dollars on the line, and there were whole careers on the line when TikTok was threatened in the US. It might seem silly to people. It might seem ridiculous that, people are crying over this platform being banned, but it's actually people's livelihoods, and that's very different than what we saw 5, 10 years ago. So yeah, I think that's one thing to point out. But I also think with all of this, my big takeaway from this was the need for evolving education. At the same time that all of this is happening and there's so much changing, a lot of times our education isn't changing with it. And I think that's what's making me really concerned. A lot of young people are turning to social media for news and for information. And of course, at the same time, there's AI and there's deepfakes and there's people who are intentionally trying to spread disinformation. And that makes me really nervous about where we're going in the future of political engagement, but also just as a society, as an informed society in the future. If most of us are getting our information from these platforms that don't have much regulation about fake news, but also at the same time, we're not being educated about how to deal with fake news, that's making me really nervous. Those are some of my takeaways. Just kind of a rant to both of you guys, but yeah, what do you guys think?
No, I agree with what you're saying, Lily, and I just wanted to add a little bit of context to some of the things that I said, and I figured that I should actually add it. A certain generation being, the dominant political ideology on the internet, at least, or is, there's a lot of it is to do with the right-wing ideology. They capitalized the online sphere first, and they managed to maintain their presence, and that's how they managed to go ahead and, flourish as well in many ways. The populist right, let me be clear about it. Similarly, and it kind of made me realize that historically, that's what previous governments or previous political ideologies have also done. I'll give an example of India. Like a lot of the people who were born in the 40s, 50s, and 60s were very pro, the Indian National Congress, and they're very pro Nehru in that sense. And the disillusionment starts when you have a younger generation growing up through the late 70s and the 80s, which, they see that, okay, things are not too great. We have a very high population, but we don't have too many jobs. We don't have a lot of these options. So there's, an anti-incumbency movement that happens against governments. And since then, you've actually seen a certain decline, a political decline of the Indian National Congress. So the reason why I'm mentioning this is that the political dominance that exists online tends to sort of shape the political ideology, or on the media, tends to shape the political ideology of a particular generation, or affects the political ideology of a particular generation. And that's really important. If it's based on facts, so be it. But the problem is that we don't know what facts are anymore, and most people don't care what facts are anymore. That's what the whole idea of a post-truth society is. And that's where it gets really complicated. So I think we're at this juncture where there's going to be a lot more radical shifts that are going to happen over the next decade or so till we reach a saturation point, and then you'll have massive reforms that are going to kick in. Don't hold me to the timeline, but yeah, next 10, 20 years, there's going to be some big changes that are going to happen. And like Lily pointed out, technology is changing so rapidly. The control of that technology is where the real power is going to be. And that's what we'll have to, keep a watch on. And hopefully, as responsible, democratic citizens of this world, not just this country. I'm a citizen of India, by the way. I just want to say that it's our job to hold people in power accountable, and that's why conversations like these need to happen.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, I think my takeaway from it is I think Generation Z are a generation who have not seen the benefit of government because government has often been on the retreat or has been very uh, sort of distracted by lots of big economic and social problems that have been going on and health crises. So a lot of it originates from the financial crash. But I think also the liberal democratic order driving, driven by capitalism has reached a point where it's not benefiting a large proportion of the world's population, and a growing number of people are suffering inequality, and a very small percentage of people are benefiting from it. So I think there's an emerging gap between what Generation Z can attain versus the reality there. The leaders of our countries are getting older, and there was a point where they were getting younger, and now they're getting older again, and they're getting very old. So why would you want to be listening to someone that is potentially the same age as your grandfather telling you what to do and how you should make the most of your life? There's a genuine problem, I think, in Generation Z, where a lot of them can't work because of long-term mental health issues or general health as well. So a growing number of kids in the UK are obese. They're not very active. They don't have many green spaces around them. Their water is polluted. They have probably a higher percentage of plastic in their bodies than previous generations, which is leading to lots of other complications as well. That's that picture. And a lot of, particularly the UK government at the moment, seems to be telling young people, well, you just need to go and find a job. You need to stop being unwell and you need to get a job, which this is just completely misses the point. And a lot of folks are on disability claims because of the impact of COVID. So a lot of people, a lot of young people are dealing with long COVID or other complications in their health. And a lot of people aren't being seen to because the NHS is the way it is, and lots of people are on waiting lists. And young people are always bumped down. So, an assessment will be made in your GP, and if you're young, you're pretty much just ruled out going, you'll be fine. We've got to deal with these other issues. And a lot of people that are being cared for are older people, and they're not being dealt with particularly well either. So I think, trust in these key institutions like the NHS, the education system, if you look at the way universities are funded and is it worth going to university anymore? In Wales, there's a particularly bit, I think it's like 32% of young people went to university last year. The average in the UK is 40%. So it's even in the nations and in the regions, there's going to be a big differentiation too. And it is a really worrying sign that you've got a lot of young men who are disillusioned and are thinking that the populist right is offering the solution for them. But in actual fact, they're probably going to be the ones that are screwed over most by their policies, which is the great irony. And a lot of people that voted for Trump will probably see that too, that they'll be left behind. And I'm sure people, look, I make a prediction that the Reform are going to do very well in the Senate elections. But Reform haven't really got many policies focused on Wales. They just want to use it as a launch pad to do well at the next general election. And they'll probably be the third largest party at the next general election, possibly even the second largest party if they can play their cards right. So that's quite, that's an interesting dynamic. And a lot of people that are surrounding people like Nigel Farage are Generation Z. They are people that are well informed, they've got the research, they're well plugged into that world too. So they're some of my thoughts.
I had a question for you both, and I've been thinking about this over the last week, actually. Do you think the traditional definition of certain political ideologies of what right means, what left means, what is center left, what is center right, do you think those have actually gone ahead and they're not as standardized as they were before? And they're a little more fluid. So do you think that the Gen Z actually looks at these ideologies in a more fluid manner, in the sense that it's not everything in the right that's actually bad, it's not everything in the left that's actually not bad? I think I'm okay with these aspects, and I'm gonna, shuffle in between. There's no, I don't know if it's like there's a clear boundary that, okay, this is me, that's you, sort of a thing, or do you think that that's actually a little more, that the divide is actually a lot more, and that the definitions are far more defined and far more minuscule than they were before?
Yeah, I think it is a case that my reading of it, of reports like this, and even studying like Sid and I, we're being basically 10 years older than a lot of people that were in class.
Hmm.
We come from education 10 years ago and come back. I think there's as much as there is gender fluidity going on, I think there's political fluidity too.
Hmm.
And I think, our perceptions of what we mean by politics are changing, or because of the way in which Generation of Z are coming through into adulthood, they're picking and choosing the bits that feel relevant to them. And that's not a bad thing. That means they're probably
Yeah,
making a more informed and have more of a nuanced view than generations before.
yeah,
So they're not saying, because I was born into a Labour Party, I will die a Labour member.
yeah, yeah.
They are saying, I'm going to make my own choices here. And all young generations have rebelled against the previous generation. That's just what being
True.
young is. But I think it's actually a lot more nuanced than that. It's not just a rebellion against their parents. It's actually, I'm choosing this because this is how I feel based on these circumstances, which I think a lot of previous generations didn't. They just went, I'm going to back Labour because I always have, or I've always voted Conservatives because
Yeah,
I'm from a rural constituency. Yeah, that's my take on it at least.
so true. Yeah. What
Yeah.
about you, Lily?
I think that is so true, and I think that also makes me think about how the consequence of Gen Z being so online and using social media, especially for political news, I think, is this memification of politics, which I think can be a good way to get people engaged, but it can also be very dangerous when it comes to making politics very person forward. I think that Gen Z is this generation that has seen very strong figures in politics. So if you think about, the last like decade of politics, even the last 5 years, there's Modi, there's Trump, there's Nigel Farage, there's all of these figures who are kind of popping up around the world. And that's just a very small handful. There's so many. And they've been these very dominant politicians that also lead to a lot of discussion online, and they are on camera a lot and they're in the media a lot, and there's these people who are kind of hungry for that attention. And I think that Gen Z is the perfect generation to capitalize on in that sense because we are online and we get our news online. And I think that then a lot of times people might feel this sense of, well, I might not agree with what Trump is saying, but the way that he talks or maybe the things that he's doing, I align with that, or I think that I'm a conservative and unfortunately Trump is the person that's leading my party, so I have to go with that type of thing where there's this kind of strange like disconnect between the person and the party and the politics. But because there are these strong characters that people are just latched onto and they're watching all day on the news or all day on their phones, that is really kind of distorting people's perceptions a little bit. I know for me at least, it's been hard to watch the news cycle lately because I think everything, and this isn't even like a political thing, I think that a lot of people might be feeling this way where it feels like everything is American politics and everything is being dominated by the Trump administration. And we don't even live in the US. We all live in the UK. And still, I feel like BBC, every other headline is something that the Trump administration is doing in other parts of the world. And that's very intentional. But I think that that's really playing with the minds of Gen Z in particular, because a lot of this stuff is targeted to them on social media and it's the way that they're getting their news. But of course, that's not unique to Gen Z, but I think that it's just what we've grown up in. A lot of us, the first time that we were politically conscious might have been like the Trump administration or maybe the end of the Obama administration. And that's just throwing yourself into a very tumultuous political environment in the US, but at the same time, it's mirrored in other politics around the world. So, yeah, I think also there's a lot of criticism of the actual individual politicians, which then plays out online in a very different way than maybe the criticism of politics or policies. Again, kind of a rant. I feel like I have lots of thoughts on these topics, but yeah, maybe you need to formulate them down a little bit more. But I think that's a big part of it is that it's so much more about the person and the videos that we're seeing. Even, the videos that recently came out, and I know it'll be a little bit late when this comes out, but of Elon Musk in the Oval Office, and his son, little X, playing around and stuff. It's like that is not really having to do at all with the policies. It's just the people. I didn't even really see much footage about what they were talking about. It was more just Elon Musk is holding a press conference with his son in the White House and the optics of that. I feel like that's just not as important when it comes to the democratic process and the actual politics going on. It's just more about the people.
Also, his son whispering to Donald Trump,
Yep.
"You're not the president."
Yep.
Just
Yeah. You should shush
absolute.
your mouth.
Yeah, shush your mouth.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that too is so like there was just so much of disdain in the way he said it.
Yeah. And he was copying his dad as well, his mannerisms. He was putting his
Yep.
hands together like,
Oh
he was
yeah?
doing,
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Should we move on to some news of the day, or do you guys have any other thoughts? Sorry, not news of the day. News around the world.
Yes, let's go
Yes,
news
let's
around the
do it.
world because yeah, as you say, there's been a lot about Trump recently, so it'd be nice to
Yeah.
get something else out there.
Yeah, let's talk about something else. So, as this episode is coming out, this weekend, the world will be watching this coming weekend. So that'll be February 23rd is what I'm talking about. But this weekend, the world will be watching a country that we haven't covered that much on the political dispatch, but hopefully we will in the coming weeks. We're talking about Germany. Germans are poised to head to the polls for a pivotal federal election on February 23rd in response to the collapse of Chancellor Olaf Scholz's coalition government. The election is taking place amid economic challenges and concerns over national security, and the far-right Alternative for Germany, or AfD, is anticipated to make significant gains, potentially reshaping the country's political landscape. I hope that we'll be able to cover it very soon on the Political Dispatch, so stay tuned for that.
And as we move from Germany to another country another continent that is usually rarely covered in news cycles is Africa. So in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the M23 rebels supported by Rwanda have entered Bukavu, a strategic city and the second largest in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, marking a significant expansion of their control since the rebellion began in 2022. We don't really hear these news stories in all of mainstream news media, but we're here putting it out for you guys. So, who are the M23? They are a prominent armed group vying for control of the mineral-rich east of the Democratic Republic of Congo. The Congolese government has confirmed the rebels' presence, accusing Rwanda of pursuing a plan to occupy and pillage the DRC. The Congolese troops have withdrawn to prevent fighting in the city. Despite the earlier chaos and looting, a sense of calm is reportedly settling in, with some residents even welcoming the M23 rebels. The UN and the UK have called for an immediate cessation of hostilities and respect for the DRC's territorial integrity, as the conflict has become a key topic at the African Union Summit.
So, two very heavy news stories there. We thought it'd be good to have some good news. Um, and that is today is International Mother Language Day, observed annually on February the 21st to promote linguistic and cultural diversity and multilingualism. Proclaimed by UNESCO in 1999, this day serves as a reminder of the importance of preserving and protecting all languages used by the peoples of the world. Events and activities worldwide are celebrating linguistic heritage and advocating for the protection of endangered languages.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode. Thanks for joining us on the Political Dispatch as we unpacked these critical issues.
In the next episode, we're going to try out something new on the show, and we're introducing something called the political mismatch, which I have to credit my friend James P with. We were having a discussion a while back, and he said, "Why don't you bring a bit of discussion in where you could call it the political mismatch, and one person picks a side and another person picks it, and you sort of have a bit of a discussion, a debate." So that's what we're going to do. We're going to pick a topic, and then one of us is we're going to draw basically a lot. One of us is going to pick one side, and the other will pick the other. So that's our plan for the next show.
If you have any suggestions for us, if anyone wants to comment or send us an email or something, the information to get in touch with us is in the description of the episode. We would love that. We have some ideas of what we'd like to talk about, but if you have anything that you would like us to talk about, go for it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And please subscribe to the podcast, leave us a rating or a comment wherever you're listening.
Thanks, everyone. See you next time on the Political Dispatch.